Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And I've got another special episode for you today because I've invited JOHN DARKO over into my studio from Darko Audio. Many of you will know him. He's one of the bigger audiophile YouTubers, a music-first gear reviewer for audiophile listeners. And the reason I invited him in is that he, more than any person that I personally know, has so much experience listening to different types of speakers than I can possibly imagine. And since everything that we do goes through that bottleneck of our speakers, it's really interesting to hear from someone like John about what they've learned about these high-end speakers that we tend to use, that we tend to work with in our daily lives, in our daily work, to see what particularities he's learned that we can take away and use for our work and use for our choice of speakers. Now, I decided to do this episode in a kind of rapid-fire question and answer style, and I sent out the request for your questions a few weeks ago, I think even before the new year, if I remember correctly. So thanks for everybody for waiting so patiently. And more importantly, thanks to everybody who wrote in with their questions. I really, really appreciate it. Now, in fact, I got so many that unfortunately I won't be able to go through all of them. There were just too many. And keep in mind that I'm still a pro audio guy. I don't do audiophile stuff. Yeah, so I'm not going to ask any questions relating to the audiophile world or individual speakers, like which exact speakers you should get. Because the short answer is, in the pro audio world, most speakers, even at the budget level these days, are good enough to get your mixes to translate. It's more about what you do with the speakers these days than the actual design of the speakers. There are very few speakers that are not workable. And in the end, it comes down to taste and budget, really. Also remember that speakers are weird in a way. Yeah, some of the answers you'll get from John aren't going to be particularly satisfying. That's just the nature of this space. Oftentimes, the truth is that there is no straightforward answer. And then one final thing before we get to the questions, remember that no matter what speaker you use, how you set it up in your room is absolutely crucial to getting a good sound from them. And I know how hard this can be, especially working from a home studio, and even more so if your room isn't a perfect rectangle. That's why I created the Phantom Speaker Test Workshop that you can sign up for free at the link in the description. This is my foolproof way to figure out where to set up your desk and speakers in your room, no matter what shape or size the room is. Obviously, this works in your standard shoebox-shaped rectangular rooms, but it also works in odd-shaped rooms, and that's the beauty of this technique. It's a really simple two-step process that just uses your speakers and your ears and some music. It's basically a structured listening test that guides you through analyzing your particular space for what is most important when setting up your speakers: low end and stereo image. Again, this is an absolutely foolproof method, and this is something that you absolutely need to get right at the very start of setting up a new studio or just fixing the sound in your studio. Yeah, so make sure you sign up to the Phantom Speaker Test Workshop, go through the steps, and really get that low-end balance that you've been looking for. Get that stereo image that actually allows you to judge not just panning, but also depth and balance in your mix. Basically, nothing is worse than not having a proper soundstage or proper stereo image, because you can't say anything about what is actually happening in the music if your stereo setup isn't good, if it doesn't work. And this is so room dependent that you need to actually do this while including the response of the room. This isn't something where you can just set up your speakers and say, I'm done, okay? So that's, again, what this process is for, to guide you through optimizing your low end, optimizing your stereo image. I highly recommend it if you're setting up a new studio or just having trouble hearing properly from your speakers. So with that, let's get to John and your questions. John?
Yes? Did I do something wrong?
No. John, is there something important that you'd like my viewers to know before we get started that I didn't mention in the intro?
Maybe that I'm not a loudspeaker designer.
Okay.
Which is obvious, but I have to restate that. And what that means, the reason I state that in such a way is because I can't answer technical questions about loudspeakers. I can talk about the experiences of that I've had with loudspeakers or whatever, or other hi-fi bits of gear. But I can't, speak to the technicalities of impedance curves. I mean, I know a little bit, but yeah.
I mean, that's not what you're here for, right?
Okay.
We wanted to talk about the experience of listening to loudspeakers and also the differences between loudspeakers, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe let's start with my personal question.
Okay.
I think that is great as a starting off point, which is, what is one thing that may not be so obvious that audio engineers should know about audiophiles, and one thing that audiophiles should know about audio engineers?
Oh my goodness. That's a starting question. Oh my God. One thing that audio engineers should know about audiophiles, I guess I would extend this to everybody, is that not all audiophiles are the same. So I know that audiophiles can be pretty painful. They can. They have a reputation as being overly obsessed with gear, very nerdy, of a certain age, men. Yes, it's a real dude thing. Generally speaking, this is, of course. And I guess I've always come at this from a point of view of being, I don't want to fall into the cliche of going, I'm not an audiophile, I'm a music lover, because that's what a lot of audiophiles will tell you. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that my passion for audio gear was started by my obsession, and I mean obsession with music and buying music and listening to music. So it's always been driven by that. And so it doesn't really come across as much as I would like in my videos. And the reason I say all of this is because a lot of my audience are like that, and they're audiophiles, and they're obsessed with, the similar kind of music to that which I am, which a lot of other audiophiles might poo-poo. But I look at audiophiles who say obsess over like gear and they have 50 LPs or 50 SACDs or things like that. So for them, they get the kicks out of the sound, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but they are driven by the sound. So they'll choose the recordings, the formats to maximize the sound quality of the listening experience. And I don't work that way. Is I choose the gear to maximize the sound quality of the music I already like and that I'm already sort of very much into, and I guess now that I'm older, have been listening to for many years. So I guess what I'm saying is that being an audiophile is a broad church. I don't think my kind of audiophile is represented all that often, or that we're not seen that much in the audiophile space, because you go to hi-fi shows, which is where you see audiophiles en masse, and I've got to say I don't see myself as part of that group. I mean, I go and I have conversations with audio engineers, but they see audiophiles as the kind of more obsessive types with this small number of LPs, this small number of SACDs, who are obsessed with sound at all costs. And I'm not. And I wish that audio engineers would see that there are more of us. And I don't want to be divisive about it, but I guess that's why I call myself a music first audiophile. So inherently, that's a little bit divisive.
Well, I guess it shows what angle you're approaching your reviews from, right? More than anything. It's like you want to make sure that people understand that you're going to judge your gear by how the music comes across, yes, and not the sound.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that the foundation of what I do is the music that I like, and that I've really started to kind of put more and more of that into videos, especially this year, and also state where I'm coming from in terms of what kind of music you're going to see in this video. So if you're expecting opera or classical or jazz, for whatever reason, I don't care whether you try and tell me that that's what you should be using. Well, I'm not, so sorry. So I'm not the person for you to watch. But just to really make it clear what I'm going to be talking about from the off, because I've had so many people in the last few years going, you only listen to electronic music, which is absolute horseshit. And the last few people who have done that, I've called them out in the comments by going, okay, here's a list of all the artists that I mentioned or showed in this video. Please tell me which ones are electronic. Because 8 out of 10 aren't. And I know this going into the comment section, but they think, oh, well, I've not heard of any of them, so they must all be electronic because I haven't heard of them, right? It's just... So I'm trying to make it clearer as to what I do. But I guess we should flip it around, or I should flip it around and answer the second part of your question is what
should audiophiles know about audio engineers from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a bit of a thorny one, this, isn't it? I mean, when you say audio engineers, do you mean people designing gear or people that do what you do?
What I do. So mixing engineers primarily.
I see. Okay.
Let's focus on mixing engineers as the primary category. Yeah. What should audiophiles know about mixing engineers?
I would say that they should know that mixing engineers or people that do what you do have a very low tolerance for speakers selling for more than $2,000 a pair, I would say, right? So I think your world's perception of price or where it tops out for hardware is very different to the audiophile experience. So I'm going to a hi-fi show in Munich in 2 weeks. It's the world's biggest sort of trade fair. And there'll be $500,000 worth of speakers in any given room, right? Not all rooms, but a lot of them. So it's mega money. Now, it doesn't really interest me, I will say that, but it's not really my thing. But I understand it's somebody's thing. And if there's a market for it, then fine, right? But people who tend to perceive, well, that's more than I could afford, so it shouldn't exist. I can't relate to that way of thinking because one man's ceiling is another man's floor, right? And I know from, well, I guess just looking at like general sort of mixing engineer rooms, a lot of them, I mean, in here you've got Head and Adam speakers that probably sell for €2,000 a pair. Really good speakers, fantastic speakers. I'm not knocking them. But I guess mixing engineers might look at the audiophile world and go, those guys are nuts. You know, they're spending $10,000 on a pair of speakers and putting them in a room that sounds like a bathroom, right? And I wouldn't disagree with them. But there is just this kind of, I think there's more of a utilitarian or functional viewpoint of gear amongst people that do your kind of thing, in that they see it as a tool, right? It's a tool to get a job done. So it's like a hammer for a carpenter, right? Having a better hammer might make your job a bit easier, but it's not the be all and end all. And I guess also mixing engineers like you, well, I mean, I learned a lot of this from you as well, know that the room is far more important. The sound of the room is far more important than the speakers that you have. And the audiophile world I don't say doesn't get that, because some of them do. They do understand that. But I guess they're listening in spaces that are generally at home, that they share with family, and family will not let them do what you've done in here or what I've done in my house. So it's almost like, well, I can't do anything about that, so it doesn't exist. You know, we're just going to pretend that the room doesn't matter, even though, as you said to me last week, you know, you're going to be hearing more than 50% of what you hear is the room, and the rest is the speakers and other stuff, right? So mixing engineers, they know that. All of them know that. This is why generally when you see photographs of their rooms, they're all kind of covered in bass traps and all sorts of acoustic paneling. And hi-fi people, not so much. And I think that's why a lot of cross-pollination between those two worlds doesn't really exist. Because we're listening for pleasure, right? And it can get pretty wanky, I know that. And you're listening, I would think, in the main 90% of the time to get a job done, to make a mix translate, I think is the word you would use, right? That's the word, isn't it? So it works in multiple different listening environments that I might listen in. It's a very long-winded answer to your first question, wasn't it?
I think that's great. It sets the stage.
Okay.
Yeah, it sets the scene. So with that, let's jump into some more precise questions. This first one is from Kurt Kurt Schennerlein, he might be German. What characteristics of engineering that goes into a speaker most affects the sound stage? And what do you look for in a speaker to get excellent sound imaging?
See, this is the thing, like I'm not a loudspeaker engineer, but I'm going to guess I think it would be lower distortion, and I guess a better time-aligned speaker will give you a more precisely defined sound stage. So where all the frequencies leave the speaker at the same time. Hopefully they arrive at your ear at the same time, but who knows what your room is going to do from between there and here. And I've tended to find that coaxially aligned drivers, so a tweeter in the middle of a mid-bass driver, generally speaking, I'm not saying that all of them are like this, but generally speaking, they tend to give you better imaging or a more precise soundstage. And that is actually one of the kind of, I guess, the puzzle points for me in your world. I mean, I'm looking at a pair of Adam speakers off to my left here, and they're not coaxial, so the tweeter's above the mid-bass driver. How does that coalesce at the ear properly when you're so close to the speakers, right? Wouldn't a coax be better because of the alignment of the drivers, right? I don't know. I don't have the answers to that, but maybe you could tell me. But do you have any issues with?
The short answer is it takes some distance.
Right.
Yeah. It might not take as much as you'd think, but it takes some distance from the speaker for sure. Yeah. Let's move on. This one is from Brendan. He asks, as somebody who seems to not only appreciate the importance of objective measurements, but also subjective impressions of audio gear, how accurately do you think we can predict the sound of a loudspeaker based on measurements?
Oh, wow. This is a ticking time bomb of a question.
Try and keep it
short. My, I'll try. So this doesn't come across in my videos at all, but I am actually fascinated by measurements, and I read Stereophile magazine a lot. And what I do is I go to the measurement section. Usually it's done by a chap called John Atkinson, who's been doing this for decades. And there's a whole bunch of graphs and paragraphs of information. And I go to the last paragraph, first of all, to read how he sees these measurements in totality. So his subjective opinion of some measurement results, right? And this is why I say very often there's no such thing as there being a 100% objective analysis of a loudspeaker, because when it comes down to it, you have to interpret the results, right? And which is what John Atkinson does. And that is by very definition a subjective process. So I don't buy into this sort of dichotomy of subjectivity versus objectivity per se, even though the measurements can be extremely informative as to what a speaker may or may not do. I don't think, and I formed this opinion from talking to loudspeaker engineers over the years, I don't think there is a one-to-one reliable mapping of if we measure this, we hear this, and if we measure this, we hear this. I don't think it's a solved problem. A lot of people say it is, but it's usually people who aren't loudspeaker engineers. Those that I have spoken to say, no, it's not a solved problem. It can help us understand if we've made a mistake, or if we're heading in the wrong direction, or if we need to start again, or if, we just need to finesse it. But pretty much every loudspeaker engineer I've spoken to says, yeah, we measure up to a point when we're designing, and then at some point that doesn't take us any further, and we have to sit down and listen and then tweak little bits and pieces after that.
That's a great answer, which leads right to the second part of his question, which is, do you feel there are certain aspects of a subjective experience, of the subjective experience, that are not portrayed well via measurements?
Well, I guess, see, imaging is, you could see a low distortion figure on an active speaker and think, well, that's probably going to image quite nicely, but it's not a guarantee. And that's the thing. None of these things are guarantees, which is why I say to people, you've got to do your own work and you've got to go out and listen for yourself. But I guess, like a bass response rating might, it obviously tells you how low the speaker will go, or where it will drop off by 3 dB or 6 dB. And that's very informative, right? But I actually did a review of a couple of tiny mini monitors last week. And one of them is rated down to 54 hertz and the other one's rated only down to 64. And to me, The 64 hertz loudspeaker sounds bigger in the low end in the room. Now, it might be looser, or that might be more distortion coming in, and that's what I'm actually hearing. But I would much rather listen to the 64 hertz speaker without a sub than the other one. So it's kind of like, well, not even that was reliable in this sense. So maybe it needs more investigation, you know? So it's a loose guide for consumers. People want all the answers from the internet so they can just go, right, I'm going to go and buy that tomorrow. And it's part of our shortcut culture. We want the shortcut to the best speaker. So if somebody says, well, here's a set of measurements that proves to you that this is the best speaker, there's nothing more compelling than that out on the internet. But as we know, life is more complicated in every respect, and it's more nuanced. And we know that kind of messaging it's a bit of a cheat, right? It's like, well, if I go and listen to these things, no, that's not what I heard at all. Or maybe, you know, you might like the sound of something and I don't. There was a speaker for years that I really liked. I'm not going to name it, but it does cross over into the studio world. And for a couple of years after I first had a pair, a few people suggested to me that the tweeter was a little bit too hot. And they were kind of right. And after they said that, I could hear nothing but it was just a bit too tizzy. Lucky there was some DSP inside the configuration panel that allowed me to take it down, and it was lovely. But yeah, sometimes other people hear what you don't, and vice versa, right? So listening together, I think, is also a very powerful experience. And I say that when I do most of my work alone, you know, so yeah.
Good answer. Good answer. Here's one from Pierrot, probably French. My personal observations are that some audio will sound good on most of these speakers, and others will produce good sound only on some and terrible sound on others. Thus the question, which audio recording processing qualities ensure good sound on most speakers?
Oh, I see.
At the very least for the sound of voices.
Well, I guess that everything comes down to the mastering, right? The recording quality and the mastering quality. Again, the mastering is not something that really gets talked about too often in the audiophile space, although there is a whole genre of audiophile music, which is by artists nobody's ever bloody heard of. But it's a genre because those recordings sound wonderful. You remember I spoke earlier about the people who are obsessed with sound at all costs? They're into those kinds of recordings. I'm not, because none of the music speaks to me at all. It's just, I don't know, I just find it a bit dull and a bit bland. I'm on about the sort of female with acoustic guitar kind of music. It's all very nice. So I don't really know necessarily what goes into that. I guess it's going to be good miking, but simple music, generally speaking like that, sounds good on anything, which is why it's played quite a lot at hi-fi shows, because you can't do your speakers that you're demonstrating a disservice if you play that kind of stuff. So I want to know how it performs in the low end. So I would love to hear something with a bit of whomp to it. But generally, the thing that I hone in on the most these days is dynamic range compression of a recording, because most modern remasters have been crushed, and I find it infinitely frustrating, especially when I'm now at an age where a lot of albums are getting reissued as 20th anniversaries, 30th anniversaries, even 40th anniversaries. And 9 times out of 10, the mastering engineer squashes the recording to make it sound louder. I'm like, ugh. But then you go back to the original, it has more dynamics, but it sounds a bit thin in the low end. And so you got to pick your poison. Yeah. And I don't think there's a perfect scenario. Maybe occasionally there are remasters that are done. I'm trying to think of an example of something that was done pretty well. The last set of Tom Waits remasters of his batshit years in the 80s on CD and high res sound phenomenal. And they maintained the dynamic range without compressing it. That's a stupid thing to say. They maintained the dynamic range, but gave us all the detail and put a bit of low-end heft in the bottom back where it should have always been. So that is the best of both worlds as far as I'm concerned. But that's pretty rare. I think to find like really good recordings is hard. And for me, if I find them in my collection, that's a bonus. But I'm not driven to find them. Like maybe a Nick Cave album might sound pretty damn good, especially some of the slower, more coffee table Nick Cave, the piano ballads. But equally, his catalogue was remastered in 2011 and they butchered it. Like, why?
I have the same experience all the time. Right. I think it's the crossover between good sound that enhances the music, right? The more you develop your listening ability, your skill, your taste, the more you'll hone in on when that match really works for you. And also just your appreciation for when the sound is very high quality and then matches the beautiful art in the music, right? And obviously both of it is art at that point. It's just that match comes together really, really well. I think that's kind of why it's so hard to also find these really high quality recordings, as you said, right? It's because our taste is also so honed in that we really only get triggered by the combination of both in kind of very particular circumstances.
But also, you might not know why you like something, the sound of something so much for a long time, and then you go, oh yeah, it's that, isn't it? I mean, I've realised that I've started listening for sort of the dynamics in vocal recordings, so the sort of breathing in, breathing out, because a lot of vocal recordings, or the vocal track in many modern recordings, it's just all one volume. It's totally flat. There's no sense of light and shade. So I've started to hone in on that. And I guess that's part of my own sort of skill development journey. I mean, we're all on a path, right? And we all start knowing very little indeed. And we might end knowing just a little bit more than we started with. But by no means would I ever class myself as an expert in any of this. I'm just listening and trying to share to the best of my ability my experiences.
Well, don't sell yourself short. You do have a lot of experience listening.
Well, experiences, yes, but it doesn't make me an expert.
I think that's kind of what makes you an expert, when you know how much you don't know. You know.
Yeah, but I'm still coming to terms with how little I know. You know. So.
This next question is more on the acoustic treatment side, from Nuno Loura, I guess, perhaps from Portugal. He asks about the room treatment you did in your house in Portugal. I follow up on what you've already said, I guess, in your videos. I'll link those below as well, because they're very, very interesting. Regarding the price benefits, would you still recommend it? Would you have done something differently or added something more to it? Your thoughts would also be appreciated, because you placed the listening position speakers across the side walls, the long walls of your rectangular room. Yeah. Technically, shouldn't it be placed across the front and back walls, the short ends? In that case, how do you apply this 38% rule, in quotation marks? Well,
the short answer is I don't. And the reason I don't is because, and I did explain this in the video actually, is that room, that my main lounge listening room in Portugal, it's essentially a corridor. So you have to walk through the middle of the room to go upstairs, and then back and through to go downstairs to leave the apartment. So I couldn't have done it the other way. I did think about it when I first moved in. I thought, okay, which way am I going to go? I thought, no, can't go the long way as much as I'd like to, because then I'm going to have speakers and then the hallway entrance is there and they're going to be in the way. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that all of my listening spaces, probably apart from my office in Portugal, are also living spaces, right? These are my living rooms. So where I've placed the speakers in Portugal it's just down to having them.
It's ergonomics in the end, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but they have to fit in with how I live. So none of this gear is going to necessarily bend my living arrangements. Not to a point where I think it's ridiculous. Now, some people might go, well, you've got all these panels on the walls, John. That's ridiculous. I guess I can't argue with that. But I guess that comes to the first part of Nuno's question. If ever I move house in Berlin, it'll be the first thing I do again. I'm never not going to have a listening room that isn't acoustically treated in some way, because the benefits are enormous. I mean, not just a tiny bit. It's probably the most significant thing I've ever done to improve the sound of everything. And this is important, actually, because I think a lot of people are like, well, why isn't John into DSD? Or why is John so down on Dolby Atmos? Well, it's because the catalogue of music is tiny. So it's only relevant to a very tiny sliver of music. But in the last few years, I've embraced subwoofers and room treatments in a massive way because they are applicable to everything that I would listen to. And the room treatment also benefits the conversation in the room. It just feels like a nicer space just to sit in without anything happening, right? So I would do it all again in a heartbeat. I mean, I think it's now I know it's the first, well, it was the first thing I did in Portugal because I knew that I was going into a reverberant room. What I didn't know when I didn't know how reverberant. It was an absolute car crash. So it was good that I had it already booked in before I arrived in Portugal for the first time. But I think the benefits are phenomenal. It's not quite as dry as my Berlin space, but it's better in the low end because there's these sort of open areas at either end of the room. So
perfect. And I think going on to the next question, I think we've kind of answered this one before, but Jeremy Johnston asks, how much of what we hear is the speaker versus the room acoustics? Like, is a mid-quality monitor in a good room better than a high-end monitor in a poor or not so good room?
Look, if somebody offered me a pair of, let's say these Adam speakers here, I don't know, maybe they're A7X, what are they, 1,200 euros a pair, something like that, 15?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, if somebody said to me, you can have those in a treated room or a pair of 20 grand, like whatever's deemed to be the greatest audiophile speaker at that price in an untreated room, I'll take those in a treated room every single time.
There you go. Good answer. So the next one is from Johan. At what level of treatment, acoustic treatment, are we able to hear the real differences in speakers? For example, do we need a certain RT60 value or rate of absorption to be able to hear real differences? When did you reach that point, and what do we need to aim for?
Well, because I didn't do it in a sort of slow, piecemeal, incremental way, it's hard for me to know where the tipping point is. But I went from a room that had maybe, I don't know, 0.7 milliseconds, maybe 0.8, maybe at some points 0.9, this is here in Berlin, to having flat, roughly 0.3. It's actually a bit lower now because I put more stuff in the room. And it's much easier for me to do my job now and hear the differences between loudspeakers with the treated room than without. Even though I did have some panels on the wall, I kind of knew in my heart, even though I probably wouldn't have admitted it to myself at the time, that they weren't really doing very much. I guess, a lot of audiophiles might do that to kind of convince themselves, convince other people. It's like a mind game, right? It's behavioral psychology. But I could never go back to the room as it was because I know I would find it harder with the reverb just colouring what I'm hearing, especially in the vocal range, right? Because that's where it really can mess things up. So you don't tend to get that nice dry sound, that you get from certain recordings. I know a lot of them have reverb in the recording, but if you get a nice kind of crisp, dry vocal that's, say, closely mic'd, you don't hear that in a reverberant room because you've got your room colouring it and it's obvious. So, the tipping point, maybe 400 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds, I'm guessing, I don't know. But I'm very happy at 300, and my room in Portugal is the same. Maybe it's a bit higher, 350. But the important thing is, actually you taught me this, is that it's not only the value, but it's the stability of that value. So it can't be like 0.3, 0.5, 0.3, 0.5, 0.3, because that's just as bad as having 0.5. In fact, probably 0.5 across the board is probably better than that, isn't it? Because at least it's even across all the frequencies.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I guess the question of like how much do we need to really hear differences in speakers, it's kind of like the more the merrier in a way, right? I would throw that in because obviously the more treatment you do as a kind of a thought experiment, as an analogy, you're removing more and more of the room towards only listening to the speakers, right? In the end, if you end up with so much treatment that you're basically in an anechoic chamber, you're only listening to speakers, as in you're only hearing the speakers because the room is basically removed from the equation. And obviously at that point, the differences in the speakers should be the most obvious in some way, right? So I'm going to kind of throw that in there. So I guess it's how much treatment do you need to tell the difference between speakers? Well, you can tell the difference between speakers in an untreated room, but the more you are able to hear the speakers, the more you can probably hone in on finer details.
I mean, I would say that people in your world, right? Are the people that you speak to who are mixing engineers, they're not working in their lounge rooms, are they? They've got a dedicated room, right?
Well, it might have been their lounge, but now it is their dedicated room.
Right, so if it's a dedicated room and you don't have treatments, I'll talk to the camera here, what are you doing? You need to have a treated room. If this is your job and this is your workspace and that's your toolkit, you've got to have a treated room. I can understand audiophiles not doing it because, other family members won't let them do it or think it's too ugly. I totally sympathize with that. But they're having to balance home life with their pursuit of better sound. When you're a mixing engineer, you're not having to balance anything, right? You're meant to be optimizing your space. So if you've got money, don't put it in your speakers, put it in your room and then put maybe, 30% of your money into speakers, maybe 40%, but put the majority into the room.
Yeah, definitely. Philip asks, what is the one frequency or frequency spectrum that is most often critical in your opinion? And is there a way to handle that or better have in mind on the production mixing side?
I think the presence region can be a bit spicy sometimes, like lower treble, upper mids, where you get the keenness of a vocal sound. And I actually like that. Not everybody does. And a lot of speakers that I listen to can be a bit reticent in that department, and it makes them sound a bit sort of cozier and richer, but I don't always love that. So that's a band I listen for quite a lot. In fact, I'm reviewing a pair of speakers soon that are extremely smooth in the top end, but they don't have that lower treble bite that I would really love. And that's the only flaw that I would say exists in the speaker, because top to bottom they're a full range floor stander. They're fantastic, but I just wish they had more bite in that. And I would say that about, I hate to say it, AMT tweeters, actually, to my ears. I wish they had a bit more bite in them, just a bit. They're a bit too smooth and pleasant and finessed, maybe. And I would just wish there was a little bit, not grit, but just,
Zing.
Yeah, a zing. So I always imagine like a tire gripping a road, a bit more grip in that area, But zing is a good word. Zip and zing, yes.
Zip and zing.
I like that.
Well, we all like some zip and zing, which leads us to John Harding's questions. What is the most common difference you hear across the different speakers? Is it the low end accuracy? Is it high end detail, for example? Are there things that are constant across any high end speaker?
I guess they're all really good. I mean, this is very general, right? They're all really good at voices and vocals and mid range and acoustic guitars. Even electric guitars. I mean, just anything that's concentrated in the mid-range. So I guess the compromise for any loudspeaker designer is, well, am I going to compromise in the bass? And that's generally a two-way stand mount will be compromising the bass by the very nature of the box. But then if you have a multi-way floor stander, well, you can get rid of that, but then you've got a very complex or a more complex crossover to deal with and design and smooth out. I guess speakers that I listen to tend to vary quite considerably in the treble and the air, what I call air, the room ambience, and we can really hear the recording space. So if a singer, Frank Black from the Pixies does this a lot, if he stood back from the studio mic, maybe by a foot, you can hear the room as he bellows like a vocal line out. And I love that. I really get a kick out of hearing that space. And I like it when vocalists sort of step back so it exposes the room a little bit more. And you only you only get that, but you notice that more from speakers that have a very extended top end. And not all speakers have a super extended top end. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're worse. It just means they're less to my taste, because somebody else might like that sort of cozier, intimate sound. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Kane Williams asks, are there any tracks, any music, any songs you think sound good on all speakers? So maybe we can use those tracks as references when mixing.
Oh, God. Well, just pick any audiophile recording. I mean, go to any... There's a store in Munich called Ludwig Beck, and it has like an enormous CD and vinyl section upstairs, well, mainly CDs. And in one corner, there's this audiophile section full of CDs and vinyl of audiophile recordings, which will have been produced beautifully and mixed beautifully and mastered beautifully. Just go and get one of those. And that will give you a great benchmark. And it's great because if you're like me, you won't like the music. So if you play it over and over and over again, you're not ruining something you love, which is also, a separate conversation. But yeah, I mean, you played that Mariah Carey track at my house last week, right? Now, I don't like Mariah Carey, but that's a track I would play because it sounded pretty good. What was it called?
My All.
My All. Is it well mastered? I didn't really notice, actually.
It's probably the kind of the top of high-end music production from whenever that was created, yeah. So it sounds, if you that's why I use it for speaker setup, because once you get it right, it sounds absolutely fabulous. Yeah. I
mean, it did sound pretty good. But something like that, I mean, if I try and think of something in my collection of albums that I really love. See, I love an album from 92 by a band called the Blue Aeroplanes. It's called Beat Songs. I think it was recorded in a studio in LA on an old analog disc. And even back then, I think it was quite a rare disc. So it's got this big, expansive sound. Now, it is inhibited a little bit by the nature of the mastering at the time, where it sounds a bit thin. But to me, I would play a track like Angel Words just to kind of get a sense of what's going on with the speakers. He won't tell me everything because I know the limitations in the recording. But there's got to be a better example than that. I mean, the Tom Waits stuff that I mentioned. A lot of electronic music like Atom TM's, his album Pop HD, phenomenal for all sorts of reasons. Like if you want to hear a very slick, tight production, is that Bernd Friedman who makes that? No, I'm going to get his name wrong. That's going to be really embarrassing, isn't it? Oh God, I hope I didn't get the chap's name wrong. I think he lives here. Just an amazing album. It's basically, the first track is like a French version of Kraftwerk. It's just wonderful. Kraftwerk's a good example, but that gets hammered by the old school audiophiles quite a lot.
It doesn't matter. I think that's it's very valuable. Thanks for that.
But modern era Kraftwerk, not the original stuff. I know, because I just love the way they beefed up the sound about 20 years ago, and that's what they play live now. Sure. The original albums, they're okay. I know that's blasphemy, but sorry.
It's been a while.
I'll have a sip of tea. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's some good things to check out in there. Alan Barichevich asks, has it ever happened to you that your speakers sounded great and then after a few days not so good? And whether your mood can affect the fact that something sounds great to us one day and not the other day?
Absolutely, mood influences your opinion of things, which is why I insist on living with stuff for at least 3 months. And it's also why I compare. I'm obsessed with comparing this to that because it provides context. So it's not just, this has got a very deep and wide and tall soundstage, because that means nothing. Like how deep, how wide, how tall? Well, I always say, well, okay, compared to this, it does this and this. So if I'm listening on one day and I'm loving something, and then a few days later, it might, and I don't like it a few days later, or maybe I like it less, or my enthusiasm has waned a bit. It might be just because new gear syndrome has worn off, as well it should, because you need to give time, or allow for that to fall away. Equally though, it's important to pay attention to first impressions, but not let them sort of cast your opinions in stone. So I listen, for the first couple of days and then sort of settle into just, play that album. I'm not really, and today I'm going to be an audio reviewer and take notes on my computer whilst I play this track and this track. I mean, that happens here and there, but I just like to live with stuff.
New gear syndrome. I love that, taking that with me.
Yeah, new gear syndrome is a thing that we all have to deal with. And it's something that you see a lot expressed on forums and Facebook groups where people get a new DAC or a new pair of speakers and go, this blows the old one out of the water. And they come out with, and I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying there's a fair amount of hyperbole in their expression of enthusiasm because they're excited. And I don't want to take that away from them, but on the other hand, it does sort of...
You kind of got to tone it down.
Yeah, because if everything blows everything else out of the water, then nothing does.
Yeah, sure.
So it's just... It's good, it's good to live with things almost to the point that you're bored of them. So you really know what they are.
What the value is.
Yeah.
Trebitz asks, there is a ton of gray area when it comes to two-way versus three-way speakers. Some say a properly designed two-way will outperform a cheaper three-way and so on. Two-way obviously only having one crossover as opposed to two on a three-way, which is harder to implement. I've tried the Kali IN8s, I'm not sure if you know those, John, which have the coaxial mid and highs, but I didn't like the tonality of the speaker and the coaxial design sounded a bit weird to me. I'd like to hear more about your experience with accuracy between both the implementations of these, if possible.
What's a two-way versus three-way?
Yeah, and like, I guess three-way coaxial as well, kind of thrown in.
So, I mean, obviously a two-way speaker is going to be limited in the low end. It by definition, it's only going to go down to what, maybe 40 hertz. You're not going to get the bottom octave. You need a sub. So there is I mean, for me, there's a joy in just a two-way loudspeaker because it can be implemented and crossed over very simply, especially if you're someone like Dyn Audio, who generally values simple first-order crossovers. I don't know what their actives are like, though. I'm only speaking about their passives in that respect. But maybe they're kind of similar. And there's a sort of almost a purity or a natural sound to that kind of implementation. But I've got to be careful not to generalize here. Because to say that all three ways are better than all two ways would be a lie. It's not true, right? So people, again, this is the shortcut culture. They want the fast answers, right? Well, there aren't any. So you might find there's a great two-way that trounces that three-way that you were considering as well. And you're right, because you've got to integrate a separate bass driver. And I guess I would imagine that's a pretty hard job because then you've got an extra crossover point to consider. And you've got to blend it nicely. And that is, for me, that's where science meets art in terms of loudspeaker design. That's how it's also been described to me by various speaker engineers. So I guess I could see why somebody might not like the way that the bass has almost been bolted on to the two-way design. And I'm a fan of the coax implementation, but again, not always, but I've never met a coax I didn't like, I guess, really. I can't think of one, but they don't all sound the same equally. They're not all sort of, I mean, some that I've heard are kind of warm and a bit rolled off in the top, and others have a bit more of that sort of zip and zing or a bit more air. So I guess that depends upon the drivers themselves and what they're made of and all the stuff that I don't quite fully understand.
For sure.
Sorry, I mean, this bleeds into like loudspeaker engineer territory, which I've like I said at the start, I'm not that kind of. I don't know.
You give good disclaimers when you've reached the edge of your knowledge.
Yes.
So it's good. Felix Dahm asks, I would ask John, when and above all, through what personal experience you came across the subject of room acoustics, how you assess its importance then and now, and what advice recommendations you would give others based on your personal experience.
My first experience with it was back when I lived in Australia, and a mate had found a factory in the southwest of Sydney that was cutting up these foam panels. So you could go and buy a massive sheet, like I don't know, 10 meters by 4 meters, and have it cut up to certain dimensions. So there was a little phase of a few of us who knew each other of just buying all these panels and putting them behind our loudspeakers or behind the listening position. And that was my first taste of a hint, if you like, of what some kind of treatment could do. And then when I came to Germany, I did put acoustic panels on the wall, mainly because I didn't really know how else to sort of tame that sort of zingy sound when you click your fingers, right? Flutter echo, thank you. And it did it to a certain extent. The couch and the rug didn't do much, I've got to say. They were obviously the first thing to go in. And then I started listening near field. And then once I got the panels on the wall, and then I upgraded my panels to GIK panels. And I think that was the time where we did our first conversation here. And I really started to kind of pay attention. And then Martin from Dutch and Dutch brought a pair of 8C to my house and set them up and showed me the mess of bass that's in my listening room. He's like, stand there and tell me what you hear. And I go, well, there's not very much bass here. He goes, now stand there. I go, oh yeah, there's loads of bass here. So that was my first exposure to how uneven the bass response can be at different points in the room. And obviously he was showing me that because with those speakers, you could apply a parametric EQ inside each speaker. and adjust the Q and the gain and all the adjustments. And that was an eye-opener. That was really cool. At the same time, I think I'd just done the Key 3, and that has a cardioid dispersion. So that made me think about sidewall reflections, front wall reflections, because it's not firing a lot of low end to the rear. So all of this sort of coalesced. And then I had planned to get a treatment done by Acoustic a couple of years ahead of when I did it. But it wasn't until we got chatting to the German distributor of Acoustic, who said, look, I can help you with this. Like, I can make this much easier for you. I can basically accelerate the process, because I was trying to get it done. And I was trying to work out, how can I review this? And yeah, so he sorted that out. And that is still technically, all that gear, all those panels are still on long-term loan. I don't own them. If I leave that apartment, they have to go back to the distributor, which is fair enough, But I guess when I said, well, yeah, I'll do this and we'll make a video, or we'll make 2 videos, because I really want to dig into this. And eventually I've made like 3 or 4 on the back of that. So I've been on quite the journey with room acoustics in the last 4 or 5 years. And if I knew back in Australia what I know now, well, it's difficult, because I rented an apartment in Australia, and you can't do shit to those apartments. You put a little thumbtack in a wall to hang a photo, and then when they come to inspect it when you're moving out, it's like, oh, there's a hole there, that's like $100 off your deposit. It's insane. So you can't do anything in Australia. It's a bit like the USA, and I guess the UK as well. Whereas, I know, because you're looking at me like very confused, Jesko, but in Germany, once you rent an apartment, you can do what you want as long as you return it to its original state when you leave, which is how I can get away with putting acoustic panels up all around my lounge room here in Germany. So I say all of that to say, like, if I knew then what I know now, I would have told my Australian self of like 10 years ago, just treat the room. But I couldn't have done it, which is the other problem. Like, if you rent, doing all this is difficult. So you have to find a way to kind of, some companies make freestanding panels, right, on wheels. Well, some are on wheels, some are just freestands. I think those are well worth looking into.
Well, I always say count the kind of the fixing up the room when you leave as part of the cost of treating the room.
I would agree. Yes,
because
yes.
You can't not do some damage in quotation marks to your walls and ceiling if you want to hang up some panels, especially the ceiling, obviously. Yeah, you can put some sort of framework in your room, and I've seen people do that, but you gotta it's a pain in comparison to just putting up some panels directly on the wall. And if your landlords are so anal about just putting a few holes in the wall, it's ridiculous. And then you just have to, you can remove, you can close up, fix up holes in the wall easily to the point where they're not visible again, which isn't that difficult. And you just got to see that as part of the process, the cost of doing the treatment in the room. Yeah.
That's what I did when Acoustic did my room here. I thought, well, okay, I've got to factor in several grand to have that room re-wallpapered. Well, I don't know why Germans put wallpaper on the ceiling, but that's a story for a different day. But the whole room needs to be re-wallpapered and repainted.
It adds zip and zing.
Apparently. But yes, that's something I'll have to do. But as you know, as many of us living in Berlin now know, that we're kind of stuck where we're living because the rental market is so hot. You can't leave, right? So that's won't be for years yet that I have to kind of do that, hopefully.
Simon Baxter says, is there a minimum price range you would recommend before investing in acoustic treatment? I recently upgraded from a pair of Pioneer SDJ-05s to Focal Alpha Evo 65. The difference was crazy. I'm hearing things I simply couldn't hear before, even with basic 3-inch safe and sound absorption in the room. So is there a minimum price range you would recommend for speakers before investing in acoustic treatment?
Okay, so the acoustic treatments that I've done, they are I say professionally installed. They're installed, right? Not by me. And they're made in a factory. So they're not homemade panels like you have here. So I think my Portuguese lounge room was €5,000 all in. but I got the low end panels for that. So,
as in price low end,
yeah,
not low end and frequency low end.
Yes, sorry, yes. Sorry, you're right.
Just to clarify.
Yeah, no, that's an important clarification to make. Yes, whereas the stuff that was installed in Berlin was a higher caliber of product. Let's use the word caliber, and I think everything all in would have been 10 grand. So I don't think it's sensible to spend between 5 and 10 grand on room treatments when your speakers are, I don't know, a €200 two-way. Just doesn't really make economic sense. But
you probably just also don't have the budget to spend 10k on a room if you invest only €200 in your speakers.
Right. But if you do have, let's say you've got 5k to spend, I would say put 3.5k into your room and 1,500 into your speakers and other stuff, right? Which audiophiles will go, you what? They will. What if any? My audience or audiophile audience that's watching this, they'll be like, what? You got to put like 50% of your budget or more into the room. I'll be like, yeah, I really think you should. But that's in an ideal scenario, and very few of us live in ideal scenarios. But again, if we're talking to your mixing engineer audience, yeah, if you're looking at a $2,000 speaker and you're thinking, well, maybe I should do some room treatment, I would try and carve out some budget to do some treatment, because some will be better than none, and you can do it incrementally. I mean, I'm not sure. Did you do this room incrementally, or did you do it all in one?
Oh, well, I mean, I did a different type of treatment before, but like this, all you see now is one go.
Okay. Because not everybody I wouldn't imagine, could afford to do it in one go, so you might have to do it in 2 stages. So maybe you tackle, I don't know, the corners and your sort of bass modes first. I don't know, you're the expert here. But yeah, I think at some point when you're spending, let's say when you're spending thousands, not hundreds, you've really got to start thinking about, well, do I spend 10 grand on a pair of speakers and just put them in my lounge room or my room as is? Or do I maybe spend 5 grand on room treatment and then the rest, the other 5 grand, on the speakers and the electronics? I know most of your audience's speakers are actives, and they are becoming more popular in the hi-fi space, but god damn it, it's a battle. It really is. So, I would just 50-50, 60-40, I don't know.
Probably more than that. I would say somewhere between 2 and 5 times the price of your speakers. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it varies. It varies. I think if you're in the mid-range, you're probably paying. It probably is worth investing up to 5 times the price of your speakers in your acoustics, just because obviously there's a threshold for investing in acoustics, at which point you're not getting any return on your investment, or you've reached the peak of what you can invest into designing and building a studio. Let's say just as an example, you're investing €100,000 into your room, which is totally possible.
Yes.
Yeah. Then your speakers are probably going to cost around 50,000. Right. So you're investing about twice as much. Yeah. But if you buy speakers for €5,000, you can easily invest €50,000 in your room, which is 10 times as much. Yeah. So like in the mid range is kind of where the difference between that is probably the highest. So at the kind of low end, you're probably investing somewhere between 2 to maybe 5 times as much. Then in the mid range, it goes up to maybe 10 times as much. And then at the very top, you're probably back down to about 2 to 3 times as much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. But but I'd still do it.
Yeah, do it. Daniel Razor says, please ask John what he thinks about these active bass absorbers such as the PSI AVAA range, bag end E-traps, and the likes. And I'm just going to throw in, out of the off, that I'm doing a long-term review of the PSI AVAA C214 right now. It's going to be a while until I get that video out, because I'm testing it in a multitude of rooms under a multitude of circumstances. So you'll get a proper review from me on that in a while, but it's in the makes, the ultimate review of the PSI AVAA.
The ultimate, okay.
But now back to you, John.
Well, obviously I can't do the ultimate review, Jesko, if you're doing that already. But
you're part of the ultimate review, if you remember.
I guess I am. So they contacted me at the start of the year saying, would you like to test these out? And I was in Portugal at the time. I said, look, when I get back to Berlin, can you send me 2? I want to have a listen. If I think they're doing something materially good to the sound of the room, then I'll make a video. But they haven't contacted me since, and time is moving, and I am interested. They do look promising. I've got a colleague in Ireland who's going to be reviewing them as well. So they're definitely not what you might call voodoo. There's no way they can be. But equally, they're not going to solve all of your bass problems in one hit. I wouldn't think. Maybe if you had 5 of them, maybe it's 10. I don't know.
Yeah.
But there's no such thing as a magic bullet in my experience in anything in audio. So just from drawing on that, I know that putting 2 of these in my lounge room here in Berlin will make and probably an audible improvement to the low end response, because I do have this 33 hertz mode. So it might mitigate some of that, but it's not going to kill it entirely. I'll be amazed if it does. So yeah, I think it's very interesting, especially for people who, like me, who cannot stand to look at enormous bass traps, even though I have some, but like I'm on about really like mega traps that are many meters by many meters by many meters. No, never.
Your room would not exist anymore.
No, it wouldn't. It would just be...
It'd just be you sitting in a cube of insulation material.
That'd be horrible. Yeah, so I think it's a very pragmatic, on paper, very pragmatic way of solving a bass problem.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Olivier Marceau, I think he might be French, asks, what is the frequency response or the quality of speaker monitors that you think we should consider when mixing music that will be listened to in the actual 2024 media, small earbuds, laptops, etc. I know that high-end and pro audio are not the same, but I'm sure having heard music in so many speakers must tell you, John, something about what should help us translate our mixes to crappy, smaller medias.
Well, I guess having those speakers and having a pair of AirPods, I think, is invaluable. Having a MacBook is invaluable, because so many people listen to music on a MacBook speakers, which are, as we've discussed previously, Jesko, really, really good. I mean, they're a feat of engineering. Sonos speakers, I would definitely have some of the little, the SL ones, whatever they're called. Those kinds of things will tell you a lot about what normal people, so not freaks like us, are hearing. And then, I mean, it's been done to death about the car. I mean, you've got to listen to speakers in the car, but the quality of speaker systems in a car, I think now varies so wildly.
Yeah, all over the place, yeah.
From sort of crappy...
just garbage. Yeah.
To an amazing bespoke install by Bowers & Wilkins or Focal or Kef or whoever. Actually, funnily enough, lots of audiophile speaker brands are getting into that space. Because, well, I guess because it's a luxury space, but... I don't really understand the question. Like, what kinds of speakers? Or?
I think that's he alluded to the answer that we gave, that you gave.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.